Welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us this evening at with the Yukon Humanities Institute. I'm Yohei Igarashi, Assistant Director of Digital Humanities and Media Studies. And this evening's talk by Simon Burrows is part of that DH and Media Studies initiative. So let me introduce my colleague, Elizabeth Della Zazzara, who will be introducing Simon and moderating. She's a historian of modern Europe who received her PhD in history from the University of Pennsylvania in 2016. And her scholarship focuses on the intellectual history of material texts and urban environments in revolutionary and post-revolutionary France. Her article, Translating Revolutionary Time, French Republican Almanacs in the US, was the recipient of the 2015 Book History Essay Prize. So let me turn things over to Elizabeth.
Thanks, Yohei. And I want to start by thanking Simon so much for being here and for being here in what is very early in the morning for him at a time when I would be unable to speak coherently. Simon Burrows is Professor of History at Western Sydney University, Australia, where he leads the Digital Humanities Research Initiative and is known for his innovative work on French exiles and the publishing trade from the Enlightenment to the French Revolution. He is principal investigator of the French Book Trade and Enlightenment Europe database project, which has been funded successively by the British Arts and Humanities Research Council, Western Sydney University, and the Australian Research Council. The FBTEE project was awarded the British Society for 18th Century Studies Digital Resources Prize in 2017. Simon is also overseeing digital development on the AHRC's Libraries, Communities, and Cultural Formation project, an international initiative based at the University of Liverpool, and he was co-founder and founding director of the Center for the Comparative History of Print at the University of Leeds. He's published 4 monographs, including French Exile Journalism and European Politics, 1792 to 1814, Blackmail, Scandal, and Revolution, and he has co-edited major essay collections on subjects as diverse as the 18th century press, cultural transfers, and the cross-dressing French diplomat Charles Déon de Beaumont. His most recent major works are the French Book Trade and Enlightenment Europe 2 Enlightenment Bestsellers, which came out in 2018, and he is co-editor with Glenn Rowe of the recent Digitizing Enlightenment, Digital Humanities, and the Transformation of 18th Century Studies, which came out in 2020.
Thank you very, very much, Elizabeth. I'm very, very pleased to be here. Before I start, I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present of the unceded lands of the Darug people from which I'm speaking today. What I want to talk about today then is the Enlightenment and ledgers digitally mapping the French book trade. 50 years ago, in 1971, in his seminal article, The High Enlightenment and Low Life of Literature in Pre-Revolutionary France, Robert Danton made his influential clarion call for literary and cultural historians to look beyond the traditional canon. And in the idiom of the time, to construct a literary history from below. Even scurrilous political libelles, such as Thévenot de Moran's Gazette et Cuirassé, or philosophical pornography, such as Thérèse Philosophe, might, he suggested, give us new insights into the Enlightenment mind, or even such perennial and classic historical questions as the origins of the French Revolution. The very same year, in Le Marché des Biens Symboliques, Pierre Bourdieu began unveiling his vision of the literary field as an outcome of unequal political and cultural power relations, in which actors, institutions, and texts compete and interact in pursuit of influence and authority. Individually and in combination, these arguments provided historians with new conceptual tools for thinking about texts and their creative or communicative contexts and implications. Together with Habermas's heuristically powerful, if empirically suspect, conceptualization of the public sphere as a bourgeois political space, published several years earlier, they challenged historians and literary scholars to think more seriously and creatively about the genesis, production, dissemination, control, reception, and of influence of texts in the process fueling what has become known as the cultural turn in historical studies. One outcome of this challenge has been the emergence of a vibrant, refreshingly interdisciplinary field known as book history, to which many of you no doubt feel you belong, or the history of the book, which seeks to uncover the creative, commercial, discursive and social processes surrounding texts and their production. Yet determining the cultural resonance of texts or uncovering the real-world impact of direct and indirect political interventions into publishing presents daunting methodological and practical difficulties. Knowing where to look for evidence and how to interpret it is challenging, especially in the face of the emergence of big textual repositories such as Gail Sengage's 18th century collections online, which offers a near comprehensive digital collection of 18th century Enlightenment era texts in the English language. Equally, the problem of determining what is representative data looms large, for historians at least, despite the potential of distant reading techniques. How can they be sure that what they have chosen to examine is the most representative, significant, or culturally resonant or transformative of texts? One major tool for this research is historical bibliometric evidence concerning the circulation of books, including those outside the canon and even lost to the historical or bibliographic record. The sources for such works are multiple and lend themselves to digital analysis, but they also present daunting challenges of interpretation, comparison, and collation. This paper discusses one attempt to confront these challenges by bringing together book trade, customs, and licensing evidence from old regime France in an industrial level survey of the dissemination of books. The French Book Trade in Enlightenment Europe, or FUBTI project, is a large-scale collaborative project or set of projects which has at various times employed the skills, imagination, and labor of more than 15 digital developers and almost as many academic researchers across a period of 15 years. So this paper is certainly not a solo author paper in the traditional sense. It also owes significant debts to the work of previous scholars, most notably the Livre Société team led by François Furet in the 1960s, to Robert Dawson's work on book licensing and confiscations under the old regime, and above all, Robert Danton's work on the Société Typographique de Neuchâtel, a Swiss Enlightenment publisher whose uniquely rich archive has come down to us almost intact, and above all, to Danton's 1996 masterpiece, The Forbidden Bestsellers of Revolutionary France, and its companion volume, The Corpus of Clandestine Literature. Forbidden Bestsellers was the inspiration and progenitor of the French Book Trade in Enlightenment Europe project. It set out to identify the best-selling clandestine literature of pre-revolutionary France by a census of around 28,000 book orders for illegal works placed with the STN, the Société Typographique de Neuchâtel, by a cherry-picked sample of 60 of their French correspondence. By counting each individual order, Danton was able to compile a list of French illegal bestsellers in which the canonical forbidden works of the Enlightenment were, for the most part, conspicuously absent. Although due to a vast back catalogue, Voltaire still came in as Danton's #1 selling author. To carry this argument, Danton, of course, needed to establish that the STN catalogue and orders were broadly speaking representative and that demand and supply married up. To achieve this, he argued that a single system of book supply existed across Europe and that the STN could and did, generally speaking, source any book from anywhere to meet market demand. This floating stock theory thus lay at the heart of his argument. It was the supposedly representative nature of the STN illegal stock that first led me to Neuchâtel to study the book trade ledgers mentioned in the title of my talk. I was at the time on a very specific mission, looking for some very elusive works, scandalous pre-revolutionary pamphlet libels attacking Marie Antoinette. Danton and many other of the leading cultural and gender historians of his generation insisted that such scandalous works were circulated in numbers before the revolution, part of the political pornography that helped, in Danton's words, to desacralize or delegitimize the French monarchy. This was a narrative I was out to disprove by cutting at its very roots. And I think here it's just worth pausing to say for people outside the field that this was enormously influential, even though there were very few of these libelles, a huge amount of historians' ink, and many, many dozens of publications contributed to this narrative of what Vivian Gruder called a veritable pornographic interpretation of the French Revolution. I think anyone coming from outside field can't appreciate just how big this was in revolutionary studies and how far it penetrated into the textbook literature. In my view, however, the anti-Marie Antoinette libelle could not have desacralized the old regime monarchy. I was convinced for a breathtakingly simple reason of this. I believed that they were unavailable to the public before the revolution. And there was plenty of evidence of policemen, reviewers, book trade professionals seeking these works, but failing to find them. The handful that were printed and found were bought up from the publishers overseas by the regime and impounded in the Bastie. However, if my thesis was wrong, the obvious place to look would be the STN account books, the only extant archive of a publisher known to specialize in clandestine works. When I visited, looked at these ledgers, I found no such evidence. They first sold Marie Antoinette literature a year into the revolution, and I have my database recording of that. And likewise, the French confiscation registers of the Parisian customs record their first such confiscation in September of 1789. So that then is the origins of the French book trade project, in a sense, that my forays into the Neuchâtel archives had shown me something bigger than my Marie Antoinette story. For I concluded that the STN accounting ledgers, so I concluded from the STN's accounting ledgers and stock inventories and order books that they'd make a fabulous database project. Armed with Danton's arguments about the publisher's representativeness, it was easy too to make an intellectual case for such a project as a major contribution to Enlightenment studies and to seek funding. Moreover, this database would be a step change in what we could do with the STN data, a dynamic source for tracing the movement of perhaps 500,000 books around a Europe-wide network of 2,300 clients, whereas Danton's analog era study and appendices gave a static vision of a whole 25 years of just 28,000 orders, rather than, it might be added, the movement of physical copies, which is what we set out to measure. So this was a mouth-watering prospect, and it took me and my collaborator, Mark Curran, just 5 weeks from our pilot project in March 2006 to write and submit our ultimately successful funding application to the British AHRC. Something probably not possible now with university expectations that grant projects go through multiple iterations and checking before you can get them in. 5 years later, after immense labour and Herculean intellectual effort, we published our database. As database neophytes, we grossly underestimated the efforts involved in thinking through, standardizing, and structuring our data. Fortunately, our first developer, Dr. Sarah Katow, soon enlightened us, not by explanation, but by example. In 2 grueling 4-hour interviews, she grilled us in depth on our data, forcing us to confront its inconsistencies and potential issues that might arise. Further, in those meetings and the years that followed, we had to grapple with a series of significant conceptual challenges. I actually, in my paper that I got here, could speak through all of them, but I think so that we have more time for discussion, it might be worth just pulling out one or two of these many issues, which included defining geographic and political space, identifying and defining and describing books and their content, defining illegality, which books could we consider illegal and how would we analyze that, defining what constituted authorship, handling uneven sources and gaps in the data, and empowering the user through easy to understand data filters within our database. And above all, we also had to have a data model for books themselves. We wanted to count the distribution of works, but we needed also, because we wanted to measure these books, we needed to know which editions were being traded, because, for example, one volume, if there was a single sale of a single volume of a 6-volume works of Rousseau, was numerically speaking very different from the sale of one volume of a 30-volume set of the complete works of Rousseau. So we had to Ferberize our data, that is to say, to link editions to works, and that's something to which I will return. So to give just one example then of these problems, or perhaps two, defining geographic and political space against the complexities of old regime Europe presented formidable database challenges, even though we were lucky enough that the geopolitical map of Europe, except for the Polish partitions and the final few years of revolutionary change between 1790 and 1794, remained pretty stable. And where there were those geographic changes, they didn't actually, perhaps by chance, but perhaps by deliberate trading concerns, impact on our data. Nevertheless, we had to contend with a patchwork of non-contiguous territories, overlordships, overlapping legal jurisdictions, ecclesiastical authority, and even in a few cases, shared sovereignty arrangements over individual towns, some of which rotated the state that was overseeing their government on an annual basis between 2, or in one case, even 3 political overlords. Defining the content and genre of books was another really difficult issue that we had to confront as well. For example, we wanted to run our analysis by being able to place books according to subjects, but should we do that by using an 18th century taxonomy, respecting the thought processes of the people who had created the archive and book consumers of the time, or should we use a 21st century system imposing 20th century classification conceptions? Equally, should we adopt a tree system in which every book had a single place, or a floating keyword system with many different keywords? In the end, we found ways by adopting 2 systems, an 18th century tree system and our own bespoke keyword system, of having both of those things. But obviously that had significant labor and other interpretative issues surrounding it. And at the same time, by using the 18th century system of the Parisian booksellers, we were able to do comparative work with many of the projects that had preceded us that had also used this system. So that's just 2 of the many examples that I've got there of the sort of work, intellectual work that we had to do. And resolving such issues, as anyone who's worked on a novel database project will know, is hard and challenging, but also sometimes exhilarating intellectual work. I still think we did more intellectual hard grunt work designing this database and working through the issues than I have done in the rest of my career combined. But another advantage of this work I think, besides empowering our analysis, is that it rendered many of our decisions transparent, both in terms of how we were presenting the data and being able to talk about it, but more importantly, through notes, through the way that we captured the data. And I think this is one of the great advantages that's often understated of digital humanities work, that it actually renders transparent decisions that in previous analog era work were often concealed and unretrievable, often due to the complexity of data. Was all of this work worth it? Well, to judge from the reception of our peers, it certainly was. My purpose here is in putting this sort of feedback is not so much to boast of our success, but rather perhaps to raise two issues. One, perhaps the inconsistency of Robert Dunton's critique of our work, but more importantly, that this was not something we were expecting when we began our database work. Such methodologically inspired praise from Dunton, from the British Society for 18th Century Studies, from Jeremy Caradonna, who said that our project plus Stanford's Mapping the Republic of Letters project helped to bring the historical profession into the age of interactive digital technologies and GIS, which was kind of generous praise. Jeremy Popkin saying no one in Enlightenment studies could afford to ignore it. And more recently, Keith Michael Baker has stressed not only our ambition, but that navigating the complexities of the work we were doing is, as he says at the end of this quote, far from easy. There's nothing mechanical about this work. It requires intellectual sophistication, historical intelligence, subtle judgment, and endless decisions. As I say, this sort of praise caught us by surprise. As far as Mark Curran and I had been concerned, we were just creating a research database. This was not something either of us had done before, and from our perspective, databases were an established technology with at least a 30-year history behind them. So in what follows, I'd like to tease out some of the reasons why Dunton, Popkin, Caradonna, and more recently, Keith Michael Baker have given us such unexpected hyperbole in their praise for the project. I think to start with, we need to understand what the database is and its building blocks. In the case of the FUBTI database project, the transactions, the individual transactions or transaction events of the STN were our initial building block. And we defined those as the purchase or sale to or from a given person in a given particular place of a copy or copies of a particular edition of a particular work on a given date were our basic building blocks, or sometimes stock taking of the same. And indeed, we've got color coding in this building block display. The white is a stock take, the blue is an STN purchase of books for their stockrooms, a red is a sale. And we can see here that we, looking at the ledgers here, one particular order, we can see the date it's sent, which gave us a date. We have got who it's going to, where they are. We've got the number of copies recorded in the column to the left. We've also got some pricing information if we chose to capture it, not in terms of cash, but it's a baker's dozen for the price, 13 for the price of 12. And we've got titles here that are also coming out of this data. So there's the Memoirs of the Maréchal de Berwick, and there is the title. In effect, the FUBT data entry process then involved converting archival evidence into these individual transaction records, ready for further enrichment with data about clients, their genders or professions, about the authorship of editions, about the subjects, genres, and legality of works, or the geopolitical location of the towns to which they were sent or from which they came, or more often we knew it because we had a hand list of the clients and where they were based. Using these many variables, individual transactions could be endlessly reassembled, compared, and queried in endless different ways, depending on one's research question. The most basic query might be for the transactions involving a particular work. As a not quite random example, let's consider the transaction records for Voltaire's Candide. Here we have not quite all of them, they go off the end of the screen, the records for Candide. So that's what a string of transactions looked like if we browse the database and go to see all events for the book, and we can see books coming in and out. We can see we don't know where the original books actually came from, so we've got some missing data there, because it really should begin with an in transaction, but in this case it doesn't. So that's what the string of transactions looks like, but we also have a facility when you do this particular query to instead map it. And here's what it looks like on our, what my daughter when she was 3 used to call dotty maps. She used to tell everyone her daddy made dotty maps, which seems to me to be a lovely description of my work. So what does this map tell us? Well, Robert Darnton's got some pretty nasty words for it. He didn't precisely say the map itself was a flawed methodology, which I entirely agree with, because he was talking about measuring statistics of demand, whereas we were talking about a different thing. We were talking about the physical movement of books around Europe, or at least the orders that are the ledger records of those physical movements. So we were measuring something different from him, and had I been doing what he did, then I would have chosen a methodology based on booksellers' orders as he did. But he goes further and says, consider the example of the greatest bestseller, Voltaire's Candide. The STN's accounts make it possible to plot every copy sold by the STN on a map of Europe, but the statistics are so trivial as to make the map useless. And he's published that in the Journal of Modern History, robertdarnton.org, a literary tour de France, and no doubt the very same words will appear in his forthcoming book on as well. But this, despite his initial praise of his work, and it seems to support Sean Tackett's comment that Darnton has a distinct aversion to digital approaches. But more importantly, I beg to differ with his interpretation, because his critique contains fundamental misconceptions, both about the purpose and analytical potential of the FUBT database and what it can tell about Candide. So I'm really grateful that he had this critique, because it allowed us to go into greater detail than ever before on what a map like this, which does appear to have relatively little data in terms of the number of books, actually shows us, and what it tells us about our methodology. Far from invalidating that methodology, this sales distribution map for Candide contains revelations which reinforce its efficacy. Foremost among them is the revelation which Darnton considered so devastating. The STN traded in relatively few copies of Candide. This research discovery, comparable, I think, to Stanford's Mapping the Republic of Letters project, celebrated confirmation of the paucity of Voltaire's correspondence with England, is worthy of reflection. By exploring why Candide is so marginal to the STN sales figures, we can learn something of the temporal and geographic patterns of the book trade. So let's begin with the chronology. First published in 1759, 10 years before the STN opened for business, Candide was well past peak sales in the period covered by the STN database. Martin Milne Frauch's exhaustive Bibliographie du genre romanesque français lists 45 pre-revolutionary editions of Candide. but only 4 of them date from the period after 1772, when the STN began trading in volume in what were known in the trade as livres d'assortissement, the works that they brought in from other publishers and booksellers in effect. So unless it took many years to exhaust the print run of an Enlightenment bestseller, we would expect few copies to have been available for purchase from the STN's Swiss suppliers by that date. Geographic analysis tends to similar conclusions. None of our 4 STN-era editions of Candide, 2 of which date from 1775, 1 from 1778 and 1 from 1787, carries a Swiss imprint, although both 1775 editions were published sans lieu, so we don't know where they were published. Mapping the supply origins of copies of Candide traded by the STN confirms, as we might expect, that they were mostly sourced from beyond Swiss borders. 50 can be traced back to Joly Veuve et Fils in Avignon in 1787, and they were most likely the Berlin 1787 edition, probably actually an Avignon edition, and 25 to J.M. Barré in Lyon in 1776 to 1780, suggesting that at least one of the mysterious 1775 editions was probably published in Lyon. A further 20 copies was sourced from Neuchâtel, from Samuel Fauche, a one-time partner in the STN in 1781. Mark Curran's attribution note in the database suggests that these copies may have been copies of a 1762 edition of uncertain provenance advertised by Samuel Fauche's son, Louis Fauche-Borel, in his 1787 stock catalogue. Subsequent research whilst preparing this chapter revealed that neither previous bibliographers nor WorldCat list a 1762 edition, though as I was writing, I realised I probably ought to go to the Voltaire Foundation and check where they are. But let's assume just for one moment that they also haven't got this edition, which seems likely. So far from being useless, our mapping of Candide's sales distribution pattern reflects both known and new information about the publishing history of Candide and the wider book trade. Moreover, unless Fauche-Borel's stock catalogue contains a dating error, it has also led to a significant bibliographic discovery, an unknown edition of Candide after all this time. So, of course, what we can do for Candide, we can do for all the other 3,600 works in the STN or FUBT database. And of those 3,600 works, 496 of them notched up greater sales than Voltaire's satirical masterpiece. So we might hope to glean a little more from each of those maps. And in a similar way as this database structural diagram, there's actually 3 structure diagrams, the simplest being just the 3-line bar at the top. It comprises client data, events data, and book data, and then those are broken down here. And then in the background, I've got, for effect, one of our early maps of the database structure. So as this structure suggests, we can track sales and purchases to 512 individual towns or 2,895 clients, or other correspondents of the STN, not all of whom admittedly took books. And we can regroup those clients into a variety of professions and professional groups. We can analyze them by gender and so on. And equally, we can do things with our taxonomic systems and our markers of books' illegality. But the FUBT database wasn't designed primarily for exploring individual editions or single works, however important. Its main use is to aggregate data on the STN's trade with whole towns or particular geographic or geopolitical units, to explore the types of literature being traded by our subject taxonomies, or to look at the trade of the STN's biggest clients or professional groups. And because all events are dated in the accounts under a particular day, we can track developments across time, which of course wasn't easily possible, certainly not possible using Danton's analog era work, and difficult to do without a great deal of further work to enrich his data with his recently published online spreadsheet data, on the STN's orders, which I have promised and will be eventually enriching and putting online in FUBT in accordance with Danton's licensing rules. Something I hope that he will agree to contribute to, because I actually think the difference between the orders that he has and the work that we have is really quite interesting for seeing how far cultural supply and cultural demand mapped up in the 18th century. And I'd love to hear his take on that, his creative take. This sort of temporal work has, for example, made it possible to infer the extent of damage done to the Swiss illegal book trade by measures taken to the French government, ostensibly to crush the trade in unlicensed counterfeit books in August 1777, or to suppress political libels, including rumoured attacks on the Queen, but were actually never published, in June of 1783. Paradoxically, it appears that the decree against counterfeit books crushed the trade in Danton's clandestine corpus, whilst decrees in 1783 delivered the coup de grace to the pirate trade. This particular graph that I've presented is merely of the Danton's libertine corpus, and we can see this massive collapse in the trade from 1777, or even before 1777. 1776 was a bumpy year for them, from which it never really recovers. It has even been possible, in large part due to the digital and statistical skills of my collaborator and sometime digital developer on the project, Michael Folk, to calculate to a high degree of confidence just how much paper the STN required to support its publishing and business operations, and from thence to extrapolate on the scale of the paper industry in pre-revolutionary France and Switzerland. Such questions, of course, can only be answered by large-scale digital analysis. Here's our actual graphing of the amount of paper annualized. Moreover, our study of the paper, published just last week in a book on the paper trade in early modern Europe that was edited by Daniel Bellingrad and Anna Reynolds, rewrites the business history of the STN through our understanding of its paper requirements by showing that just 3 editions de luxe out of over 200 editions the STN published accounted for over half of their paper consumption. Since paper accounted for about half the cost of book production, this commitment to Enlightenment intellectual glamour products, notably the first quarto edition of the Encyclopédie, of course, the subject of Danton's book on the business of Enlightenment, which had some very useful information for that article. This edition, the STN only actually printed, I think, 5 of its volumes, but nevertheless, it was it required a huge amount of paper for this consortium product. Together with their own enlarged edition of the Description des Arts et Métiers, these things tied up a huge amount of the STN's capital. As a result, Danton's view of the STN as ideologically neutral capitalist entrepreneurs specializing in cheap popular octavo books, which seems so credible when we look at it in terms of total book sales, suddenly looks untenable on multiple fronts when we look at the paper consumption. The STN tied up so much capital in Enlightenment prestige products that their business almost collapsed when the Description were denied permission to circulate in France. And eventually they have to sell the privilege holder of the first edition all their volumes for a cut, but actually quite generous price. But for many, many years, they've got all this money just tied up in unsold stock in this one work. But the FUBT database also revealed a problem with the STN data and the way that previous scholars had characterized it. The STN were, it soon appeared, dealing primarily in Swiss books, and 2/3 of the books they traded, they published themselves. So unless the Swiss were producing the same books as London, Amsterdam, and Rhineland publishers, which, as we did what sampling we could of those publishers and their output, seemed increasingly unlikely, this undercut claims that the STN was in fact a representative publisher. This in turn undermined much of the initial rationale for our proposed monograph studies, particularly our second volume, which in light of that problem I took on, it was originally destined to be Mark's volume, on the dissemination of Enlightenment discourses. Or at least it would have fatally undermined it had not digital analysis come to our aid. For to address these problems of representativeness, we realized we needed to incorporate a series of easy to use data filters, options menus, as we called them. And in the end, there were 9 of them. No, 8, sorry, the option summary is not an option menu itself. And these make it possible to filter the queries by various variables, predefined: client business type, client gender, data source, edition type, that is by putative place of publication, with separate categories for various classes of STN output and Neuchâtel editions that separate them out from other Swiss editions, by the language of the edition or original publication, or by markers of illegality. Further, these options worked cumulatively, so endless combinations were possible. And this made it possible when running queries to isolate STN books, say, from imported trade books. And in the process, it allowed us to define and interrogate a whole range of new, perhaps more representative, and what's representative depends on your particular research purpose, subsets of books and clients. Crucially, books imported from abroad were indicative or representative of the wider trade in books. So by isolating them, we could get something that was rather similar conceptually to Danton's semi-mythical floating stock. But we could also compare and look at the trade of private individuals making individual purchases with say, the purchases of book trade professionals elsewhere. Or we could compare sales figures and breakdowns for illegal books sold to France with sales of the same titles elsewhere. So we could contextualize Danton's work on the illegal corpus by comparing sales in France, which he'd studied, with those elsewhere. A key finding of the STN database phase of the FUBTI project was that to confirm our conclusions, we also needed comparative data, despite this ability to make more representative data sets, and they would have to be drawn from other sources. This required us to think a bit more carefully about our data and what sources we might use next. Our key insight concerning the nature of our sale, purchase, and stock take transactions was that on closer inspection, they turned out to be just 3, or if we see sales and purchases as opposite ends of the same process, perhaps just 2, of the many types of datable, geolocatable events involving human actors and material books that could be captured in a database. So our data structures could be adapted to accommodate this by recording a greater range of events and making it possible then to pull out the events you want on one level, or to see a whole greater range of events in the life cycles of individual books or genres, or possibly relating to the production of particular works which we describe, particular key works to describe their themes and so forth. So we did that work on a new data model in the Sydney summer of 2013 to 2014, just a year and a half after we published the original FUBTI database. But due to the piecemeal arrival of funds, personnel changes, and so forth, the structural changes envisaged were not fully implemented at that time. Data from various sources continued to be gathered independently and was only later combined into a unitary FUBTI2 database, as we call it, which is still in the course of preparation. In what remains of the talk then, I'd like to look at those sources and some of the things that they're already proving and showing for us. The first of these new sources is the confiscation registers, the records of books seized at customs in Paris. Now, these are actually quite well-studied documents. They've been the centerpiece of Robert Dawson's Svec study of confiscations at customs, and were used by Robert Darnton to compile part of his corpus of clandestine literature to compare to the STN records. Dawson concluded that the ancien regime system of censorship and control was so complex and contradictory that it collapsed under its weight. Darnton, like Tocqueville, contended the system was inefficient and easily circumvented, and that due to resulting free circulation and reading of banned libertine books, the regime lost its legitimacy. Such teleological and political readings fail to explore whether the system achieved the primary mercantilist-driven aims of Bourbon policy, such as defeating literary piracy, excluding foreign interlopers from the French book market, and minimizing the circulation of the handful of books that they most feared. They're also based on the false assumption that large-scale international book smuggling was a practical option, whereas in fact, especially after 1777, the French book trade was tightly controlled at every point. Entry ports and towns where books coming from abroad had to be sent for inspection were clearly defined by law. Means of onward transport were frequently prescribed. For example, book dealers were only allowed to send books from Rouen to Paris by water. Carriage by road was expressly forbidden. This is significant given that a lot of books arrive from, say, Amsterdam by water to as far as Rouen as well, and Rouen's one of the big centres of book production. Even moving wholesale quantities of books around Paris was the monopoly of 24 licensed gang deniers. Bulk smuggling across borders, as Mark Curran has shown, was a very costly and difficult enterprise. It took a long time to set up. It involved trust with smugglers, it involved avoiding border guards, and it involved traveling across the northern French plain, which is kind of open land. So it's the rare and last resort of desperate dealers, not something that's done every day. Wholesale consignments of books were bulky and had generally to move through established channels. Opening the records to digital analysis allows us to address these issues afresh by taking a more holistic view of these complex records and to see up close patterns which were not previously visible. One pattern that is already apparent and easily demonstrated by the metadata about the confiscations and where they came from rather than the books contained in them is the impact of the decrees of August 1777 and June 1783 on the importation of books from various parts of Europe. The new regime of centrally appointed inspectors instituted in 1777 seems to have had the desired effect of preventing local guild collusion, and there's many letters of booksellers telling the STM they can no longer rely on that and they're withdrawing from the illegal trade. So it stopped local guild collusion in smuggling, but we can see this very, very clearly, not only by the STN graph I showed earlier, but by metadata showing the numbers of books coming to Paris and being confiscated by the authorities in their regular customs searches at the Chambre syndicale, at the Guild Hall, where all book consignments had to be inspected. So I divided this into 3 chronological periods. The arrows represent the number of books appearing, being confiscated between 2 sets of dates at the top. So we've got the dates at the top, we've got the places they're coming from, the frontier ports, and the dates are set by the different decrees. And then I've added a month to allow for the decrees effects to filter through the system and be known. And there's a difference too. After 1783, all book consignments have to go via Paris, whereas before that it's books consignments being sent into Paris. And this shows that after 1777, there is basically a total collapse in the number of books that are coming in from the Swiss entry ports, La Cure, Morez, and Les Russes, and from those for Neuchâtel, Le Flambourg, and Pontarlier, and that Avignon also has the same phenomenon, but unlike the Swiss, who kind of bounce back or continue sending things into the south of France, the Avignon trade just never seems to recover from this, as far as we can judge from this confiscation metadata. Elsewhere, the picture is more complex. Books get rerouted and so forth, but we still have the same picture of a significant decline. One reason some of these numbers continue is that the books confiscated come in many forms. They may include periodicals which haven't been seen. They may include new works which are innocuous and haven't been through the censorship system. Nouveauté, an unstable category, because once a nouveauté is found, it's sent for censorship and often becomes a legal book thereafter. The decrees of 1783, as I've just indicated, had a rather different effect, requiring all book imports to be inspected in Paris. So we get more consignments turning up after 1783, but they're consignments for all of France, probably mostly actually for dealers in southern France, for whom it still might make sense, despite in terms of timing, to order from Switzerland, even if the books had to go via Paris to be inspected. Now, all of the stats and for all the other ports are going to be published fairly soon in French History and Civilization. I've got 3 or 4 slides like this that include the British and the Belgian ports and the explanations of what's going on in each of them. But I haven't got time to go through that today because it's not the key point. I'm more wanting to illustrate the sorts of things that we're able to do with this data. Intriguingly, confiscations of pirated books did not fall off significantly after the decree of 30th of August 1777. This was something I only discovered when I interrogated some data on the actual books this week. That surprised me because we saw the collapse of the Swiss and the Avignon dealers in pirated books. But when I interrogated the data further, I found that what did change was where those consignments came from. Data entry on the Parisian confiscations is not complete yet. We still have to record books after the 21st of January that were confiscated, but a clear pattern is nevertheless visible. Between 1771 and 30th of August 1777, a significant portion of pirated books confiscated by the Parisian customs, and here I'm counting instances of confiscations, not the actual physical number of books, arrived in consignments forwarded from ports of entry on the French border, such as Tourcy and Sedan, entry ports for Belgian books, or from Le Frambourg-les-Russes-Moret on the Swiss border, Pontarlier and Les Russes as well, of course, or Calais and Dunkirk for British and Dutch books. However, from September 1777 to January 1780, not a single consignment containing pirated books arrived from these places. Instead, with the exception of 2 consignments from Avignon and 1 from Valenciennes, all the confiscated piracies arrived from inside France. The decree had not eliminated piracy, but instead it appears to have achieved a kind of mercantilist aim of the decree of bringing piracy within French borders. A second data set is the records of piracies that were legalized in the estampillage exercise of 1777 to 1781. And these come through a census of these records. These records of the estampillage survive in Paris in the archives of the Chambre syndicale for 8 of France's 20 Chambre syndicale districts. These records were used by Furet's team for Religiosity and by Anne Bose and Robert Dawson, as well as Jean Vérin-Forêt. But though they've been studied, they still have secrets to reveal. This data is valuable in part because we need to know really whether the piracies that we've found with the STN were typical of piracies found elsewhere in France. Certainly many of the same titles and authors do turn up in roughly the same quantities in the STN data and the estampillage records, which by a strange coincidence, I think we have 413,000 STN sales. We have slightly more of their in transactions, including printings. But we have almost exactly the same number of books in our estampillage sample. So one case in point would be the total number of works by Samuel Tissot, which are sold, about 4,000 in both collections. But some sectors of the trade are also more or less absent from the STN data. The most obvious example is pirated Roman Catholic religious literature, since the STN was a Protestant publisher and hence across its lifetime only traded in literally a handful of copies of Catholic devotional works such as the Imitation of Christ. But further analysis may show other areas of silence too, and we've yet to do the work to analyse that. The third data set is the permission sampler registers, a new licensing of previously frequently pirated works that was allowed across these last 12 years of the Ancien regime. These records have also been studied by Robert Dawson, who produced an annotated listing, but digital analysis allows far more complex readings and comparisons to other sources. Taken in combination with the estampillage registers of the amnesty, the permission sampler registers appear to confirm that religious books were published on an industrial scale in volumes which would have surprised even Furet's team, I think, to whom religious publishing was really of little interest. They found all these religious books and then hardly say anything about them in Livre et Société, not compared to what they have to say about other books. Or perhaps even to Dawson, despite his encyclopedic knowledge of these sources. Here, my case study of the Besançon book trade in my 2014 article, Charmé and the Book Police, is instructive. And here are the sort of statistics for what was stamped in Besançon, showing that in the visitations that took place in 1778, the booksellers of Besançon declared a total of 62,000 books for stamping, of which 55,000, 87%, were religious titles. Robert Danton, who misconstrues my argument, has suggested there's nothing particularly novel or surprising about discovering there were lots of religious books circulating in 18th century France. And I couldn't agree more. As I noted in the article, historians have known this ever since that foundational work by the Livre et Société group, by François Furet and his collaborators. But what I'm saying is that the sales volume, the scale of religious publishing and bookselling dwarfed all else combined. And the scale of what I'm talking about is new. For the number of copies of best-selling religious works selling in and around Besançon in the late 1770s and 1780s was, I think, truly staggering. In sources which were far from complete, primarily the estampillage records and the permission sampler registers, but also local confiscation records, I was able to trace over 50,000 copies of a single collection of private devotions, the Ange Conducteur, circulating among the booksellers of the Franche-Comté in just over a decade. Now, the Franche-Comté at this time had a population of less than 800,000. Some sources say 600,000. And most of those are peasants. So these figures imply a social penetration within this one decade of this 100-year-old devotional manual at a rate of 1 copy per 16 people, or perhaps 1 in 3, 1 in 4 households across the province. And this in turn suggests that the Ange Conducteur alone was owned by far more people than the 1 in 20 peasants who left evidence of owning religious books in their wills. So if Besançon was representative of other provincial centres across northeastern France, or these results can be replicated for other leading religious titles, they represent a major challenge to current historiography. They call for us to rewrite simultaneously our histories of publishing, reading, and popular religiosity under the late Ancien regime. Whether the figures prove quite so decisive remains to be seen. We're still developing our analytical tools for the project, and my feeling is that religious books are present in lesser numbers elsewhere. But our provisional figures on the works printed in the greatest numbers under the permission sampler and stamped most frequently during the estampillage exercise of 1777 to 1781 tend to support the conclusion to a considerable extent. Fully 19 of the top 20 works published under the permission sampler were religious titles. The 20th, I might add, was an how-to accounting manual for use in your workshop or business. Moreover, the top 5 most stamped works coincide largely with them. We can see them here, the Ange Conducteur and the Journée du Chrétien, reversed in order. The numbers are smaller because it's a smaller sample. There's something like, there's over 2 million books in the Permission Simple print run records. We only got 400,000 in this sample. So the numbers map on pretty well, since we should be using a multiplier of 5 perhaps. And then we've got the Instruction chrétienne pour les jeunes gens. We have another instructions for Christian youth that will be there in the Permission Simple, not so far below. We've got the Imitation of Christ, which does appear in quite big numbers in the pirated records too, but not in the top 5. So we can see this sector of the trade absolutely dominated by religious works and relatively few religious titles. Fourth data set, the works in the Bastie inventory. This is going to be the last data set that I add in the first tranche of FUBT2, and it's going to take a bit of work due to various issues we've found in the data as it was entered. So we're going to have to redo a load of checking. This inventory contains the confiscated books found in the Bastille following its capture by revolutionary crowds in July 1789. Published and hence preserved for posterity by Robert Dawson, the original of this document is now lost. This data exists largely as a control data set to compare with the Parisian confiscation records and Danton's largely STN-derived corpus of clandestine literature in France, in order to see whether the works the regime was impounding resemble those found in book trade sources. Since the regime also pulped many confiscated books in the Bastille, we have to be careful what assumptions we make about the books it retained. But generally they do, like repressive bureaucracies everywhere, seem to have liked to keep hold of a few copies of everything to do with criminality. So very often they pulp, most kept a few books in reserve, a few copies. My initial comparisons discussed in my 2018 monograph, Enlightenment Bestsellers, found that the books in the secret depot were more politically focused and that it tended to contain pamphlets that were of local and ephemeral interest, probably circulated outside the trade, and that therefore do not appear in book trade sources. But further, it allowed me, through edition level comparisons to works in Danton's corpus and the estampillage and Permission Simple data, to make a closer, more detailed and better informed guesstimate of the scale of the illegal book trade than previous luminaries. So here, with some numbers added, is my best attempt at what the illegal and quasi-illegal book looked like. In fact, my estimate in some ways coincides with Danton, Daniel Roche and Roger Chartier, based on estimates that the number of books produced in French language, mostly inside France, in the last 20 years before the revolution amounted to about 60 million. It seemed that half of all books circulating in pre-revolutionary France might be considered illegal. But I added the caveat that illegality of itself is not a very helpful term, and indeed sometimes has been used in a manner which is quite misleading. In pre-revolutionary France, the illegal included innocuous books and nouveautés, which hadn't been through the formal permission system, and which when discovered at Parisian customs, were usually sent to the censors, as we've heard. Unlicensed versions of legal works were also included, more often than not religious ones. Heterodox Christian works of all sorts, including, in theory, Protestant Bibles. And then there were the many degrees of so-called free-thinking libertine or philosophic works, including very mildly erotic anthologies of poems or scholarly tracts about divorce or the ruses of the medical profession that in combination make up a large part of Danton's corpus of clandestine literature, alongside political exposés and libelles damaging to the reputation of powerful persons, hardcore pornography, and materialistic works. I use hardcore merely as a point on a spectrum. Obviously, in the 18th century, no one is actually being physically photographed, let alone physically harmed in the creation of this material. and most of it isn't illustrated. There was also the quasi-tolerated sector of works published under permission tacite, a typically old regime subterfuge where books were tolerated to circulate, usually under a false foreign imprint, without the imprimatur of official approval. Thus, government connived in the circulation of books which to ordinary readers had all the hallmarks of illegality. Readers reading them thought they were being naughty when the government was okay about them reading it. The result of all my number crunching, which is available in an open source online appendix via the publisher's website for Enlightenment bestsellers, which I should also add came out in the last few weeks in paperback, is this pie chart. It posits that only about 10% of illegal books circulating in France before the revolution were free-thinking livres philosophiques, the corpus of clandestine literature type works. And of these, the STN evidence suggests that at most 1 in 20, or 0.5% of all illegal works, or 0.25% of all newly published works circulating, were materialist or pornographic. And here I'm talking about total copies. In contrast, the majority of illegal works were likely piracies of authorized and entirely orthodox religious works and devotional manuals. And these figures don't even include nouveautés, which accounted for 774 of the Parisian customs confiscations in the decade from January 1771, almost as many as for prohibited and pirated works combined. Clearly then, the illegal sector was somewhat different in character from the world of libelle, atheistic and pornographic works on which most previous treatments of the illegal sector in pre-revolutionary France have fixated. This is not to say that the sort of free-thinking literature is not worthy of study, and it may indeed have been a motor of social and political change, as some historians have suggested. But we need to keep it in cultural and social and indeed bibliometric perspective. The bibliometric evidence suggests that this literature gained a new and unpredictable significance in the maelstrom of revolution, where libelle began to blend much more systematically pornography and the opposition of the church to political reform spurred interest in alternatives to Catholic traditional worship and ultimately in wholesale de-Christianization, which caused a renewed interest in the materialist works of the Enlightenment. My final record set are the records of some 25 Parisian booksellers' stock sales from the period 1769 to 1787, most of which sold the stock of deceased or bankrupt dealers. These are less useful for comparing with the confiscation records because most of the works sold were likely to have been permitted, legal, and not pirated, particularly since they were advertised and administered through the Booksellers Guild and only sold to their members. They do, however, in many cases include sale of part shares in many of the privileges, and more importantly, they tell us a lot of the ecology of the French book trade that we cannot discern through sources that treat the provincial trade. Due to their monopolies and aggressive protection of their privileges, as well as their location in the country's intellectual, cultural, social capital and its largest city, the Parisian book trade has always been seen as a separate world from that of provincial publishing and bookselling. Just how separate remains to be seen once we've classified all the remaining books in the database and viewed which books the Parisian booksellers were most avid to buy from their deceased and bankrupt co-workers in the trade. So I'm going to end this in a moment, though I'm going to foreshadow the 4 pages that I could talk about that I had at the end of the paper before. This overview of the data sets and types of events I'm bringing together in the FUCTI 2.0 database and intend to publish next year is not, of course, the end of the story. In question time, I'd love to talk about the other historical bibliometric projects with which I'm currently working and our attempts to create a single data universe for looking at the world of book production, dissemination, reception, and consumption across the 18th century. But I hope I have already shown that by bringing together just my French data sets and with my analytical tools still only in preparation, we can gain unprecedented and often highly revisionist insights into the production, circulation, and control of books, and with them, many of the factors that shaped the literary field. Thank you. I hope I've not overstayed my welcome with the length of the presentation.
Thank you so much, Simon. That was great. I enjoyed every minute of it. One of the things that always strikes me every time I look at the database is how much work went into it. It's one of those things where it's so obvious as soon as you, especially once you get down to sort of the granular, like what are all the events associated with any given title, how much work had to go into gathering that information and, you know, bringing together information from disparate kinds of archival sources and making sure they all made sense together. And so one of the things I was thinking about, though, is that it's obviously an amazing amount of work, and you guys have done such a great job, I think, of giving the user different ways to approach the data with, as you explained, like with the options, but also, you know, having an 18th century taxonomy and a 21st century keyword system, or by looking at 18th century geographic markers or 21st century geopolitical ones, right? There's all these different ways to approach the data. And in some ways, I think like that was obviously incredibly hard, but I also wonder if it was simplified by the fact that you're talking about this one archival source or the set of archival sources from this one place. And I'm curious about how you envision bringing together all these disparate sources into a single sort of data universe, as you said. What do you think some of those challenges might be?
Well, we've had to solve some of them by the data I'm using at the moment. So I think, obviously, all the projects that have been done to date have, to some extent, done their own thing. We don't have standards that are in common. One of the reasons for that is that France has nothing like the ESTC. We have got this fabulous Gallica resource, which in some ways one might want to trade for the ESTC, but for this work, it's not yet there, and data at BNF is both much more complex to use, requiring you to have developers and people who can really manipulate that data to make the best of it, and not comprehensive in the same way across the entire French-speaking world in the way the ESTC is. So that means that we have a particular set of problems. We can't just import ready-made bibliographic data. So we're dependent on, for my sort of work, in identifying works. Firstly, we can go to the catalogues of the publishers and booksellers that we're dealing with if they're extant. But then we kind of have to use, because of the speed we're working with and the amount of data, we really have to use things like WorldCat, which can return you hundreds of things and take a load of filtering and slow you down. Theoretically, the Karlsruhe portal is better, but I find it times out working from Australia, and often I can't get those things. So we've got a whole heap of different issues there, but I think the basic one is an agreed set of structures, and you know, each project has some legacy issues there, including my own. You know, there's some major things I wish we'd got right at the start. I don't think anyone was using uncertainty indicators, for example. You know, we have uncertainty recorded in all sorts of ways, but our biggest way is through notes and things. And in retrospect, you know, an indication of 1 to 5 and a brief why might have made a lot of that work easier and more standardized. We just don't have that there. I've introduced precisely that sort of system for my classification of books now, because I've got so many books that need to be classified. I often do it on the basis of title alone, which I didn't really dare do with FTSE1 unless as a default I had to, because I couldn't get my hands on a copy digitally or in the local library or any bibliographic information at all. Whereas now I do it as standard because I can mark this was classified by title alone, and then presumably later on users can get back to me and say, well, actually, I think this is a particularly interesting book, maybe you should think about it again, or I can go back to it.
Or this is a book with an especially misleading title.
Yeah, absolutely. But, you know, generally, particularly when we're in the world of religious books and things of the 18th century, you know, you can tell from the imprint, or if something's satirical, there's usually some sort of giveaway. A few will obviously go beneath the radar. but those ones are likely to already be known to us through the work of previous scholars, and above all by Robert Darnton's corpus of clandestine literature. So we might not recognize them. For a long time, we had this in the STN data, that the most dangerous works were sometimes reported under code. There were only about 3 of them, the Système de la Nature, but this work called Ovo Rubro, and we didn't have the first idea what it was, and we didn't know it was a code. And eventually we suddenly realized it was Earth Rouge, which is another clandestine work of the MOPU sort. But to go back to that question, how do we bring them together? We need some sort of common structure and an event-based ontology. Now, there are some event-based ontologies out there, but they're complex. So the Thurber system, by which we of hierarchically arranging books through editions, through different versions of the text, through and above that works, and then below down to individual items and volumes within those items. Also has a related system called Thurber, which is event-based, but it's too late in the day really for me to get into using that, given what we've got. But I think if you've got a typology of events, there's not actually so many different types of events. You know, we might have a reception event, we might have a licensing event, we have a sales event, and then you can have subtypes to deal with that suit your data. That can become quite obvious if I show what the current FUBT2 database. I'm still adding a little bit of data to it, and I haven't brought in all the FUBT data because it would actually add FUBT1 was easier, even though it was incredibly complex. We actually have more transactions or events in that than by a factor of 2 than in the other data, and I was just a bit scared it would clog up my data in the early stages of analysis and so forth, and possibly slow the performance of Heuris to bring that in now. So I'm leaving it to the end. Okay, so I'm going to share screen just to show what it currently looks like. It's not quite as exciting as some of the other things, but
exclusive sneak peek.
Exclusive sneak peek. I should have arranged it chronologically, but I haven't. Okay, so we basically have a load of different events. What you can see here says Parisian confiscations, but some of the other records say estampillage, some of them, and so forth. And then we can see that there's a subtype of confiscation here, because confiscation records also contain seizures when the police went on raids. There's only a few of them in the data, but I've treated that as a separate type. Then we can see the bookseller involved. If we want more data, and I click on this one, there's an image that's not working for some reason, but we can see here's my sort of metadata about my data model at the start, the event type and the subtype. We've got manuscript information with all which clickable. In Heuris, I can define what's clickable, the sort of
so you can sort
so forth. If we want a closer look at the data form and to edit it, we actually get the data more helpfully here. Because I've got so much data, I've actually got two sets of tabs across the top. So there's my metadata. There's the sources it's drawn from. Here are the key people. I have a model of agents who have roles. That's how I deal with the event. So within every event, there's a record owner who's the person or institution who are responsible for generating the archival record. Right. Because even if it's a purchase record, it's going to be the seller or the buyer's archive that's doing that. So it kind of works. And then I have the primary agent, who's the main person in relation to that. So if it's an STN sale or purchase, STN would appear as the record owner, but right. The primary agent's role would change from holder to acquirer or whatever. In fact, holder's not purchased. So there's acquirer, there's also seller. So holder is someone who holds the event at the beginning and the end. So it could be, you could also have that for a basically owner. And then you can see the datings there. Now, all the events have these things. So confiscation resolution is specific to the confiscations. They've all got event notes. I've got my private research notes of things that need to be followed up later. And then, as well as confiscations, there's other data set specific things. So the page stamped in the estampillage record or what have you. So we've been able to preserve data we brought in from elsewhere. Because Hurist is infinitely manipulable, you know, even if all sources have their specificities, as long as you're prepared to deal with the number of fields, then you can just keep adding those event-specific types of things. So that's roughly what the data looks like there. The bibliometric data is, bibliographic data is fairly straightforward, just as in the FBT database, and it's Burberized. We've got the work and we've got the edition recorded. One of the really bad things we did, partly because we got so much data, was we felt we couldn't record in FBT 1 exactly what it said every time we found a book or whatever.
Right.
Now your red fields are compulsory fields. So if I edit this field and try to save it, I now have to put something in this field. But in most cases, the more recent cases, I'm writing down exactly what it says in the confiscation register, because that is really important, I think, in this data set, and is best practice, obviously, anyway. And then we've got different types of units, because sometimes our sources don't tell us copies. So that's going to be a complexity when people interrogate the new data. They'll have to choose the unit type or types they want.
Yeah.
But wherever possible, we try to do copy, or we have something called an equivalent full copy. So if you've got a 20 volume set and you've got 1,000 copies of volume 1, that's 50 equivalent full copies. But we can also record the exact volume numbers here. And this is a slight loss of functionality compared to the first FBT, where we can write out longhand the exact volumes and the total number of volumes, but we don't have.
There are 6 of volume 4.
We're counting in a different way because of the way some of the interim data was gathered.
That makes sense.
So,
I have another sort of digitally question, which is that we talk all the time about the internet being forever, but obviously there are many ways in which digital sources are incredibly ephemeral, especially born digital sources, and especially complicated ones like this that aren't capturable by, say, the way online text is by the Wayback Machine. And I'm wondering if you guys have plans in place to sort of future-proof or to ensure the longevity of the project, or if that's a concern.
Obviously, it's a concern. One of the projects that I've not talked about within our current project, and I hope to bring its data into the main FBT database, but we're first going to put it into a bespoke database, is I'm working with Angus Martin, who's the sole survivor of Angus Martin, Vivian Milne, and Richard Frautschi, who put out the Bibliographie du genre romanesque, which I referred to, which is the standard bibliography of 18th century novels. Very, very comprehensive work. They published in 1977, and it covers the second half of the 18th century. But shortly after they published, they decided to do the first half of the century as well, and to create a database of all of their work for the whole century. And that's still sitting in 1980s software, though we have got some outputs from it. With my first Western Sydney developer, Jason Ensor, and a bit of help from Vincent Hirabaran, who was my last one in Leeds, and more recently, Michael Folk, who's working in partnership with me and Angus now. We are retrieving from 1980s software with 1980s structures, sort of linear sort of database, which Angus used all sorts of symbols to make it operate almost as a relational database.
Oh, wow.
So we've got all sorts of complexities, and it exports, usually Angus's way of exporting is a year at a time. So we're gradually repatriating that into this database. I've already made the structures in Hurist, and we're literally on the verge of moving the data out. It should be added that Angus is in his 80s. This is his life's work. He's very nervous about bringing it into a new system. And you know, and he's also very nervous about anything that makes the project come to an end, because, you know, it's as his daughter said, you know, this is what really keeps him going and gets him out of bed in the morning. So it's a diplomatic issue, it's practical issues, there's making sure he can continue to work on it, and yet we want a finished product in some ways. We promised it to the ARC. We're going, Angus and I, actually at our own expense, because the funding that was meant to pay for it has expired, will be producing a number, 15 or 20 hard copies of that database. Not so difficult as FBT because it's just a bibliography, basically. So there's hard copies for data preservation. So on one level, the answer is we don't quite trust this. I've managed to keep FBT going for 15 years. I've managed to move to a stage where its longevity and my ability to work on it is no longer dependent on having big grants, but to do the linked open data stuff and develop it in the ways I'm thinking of ambitiously, big grants would really help. But the fact that Heuris is an open data, open source, and is developing its tools for our use. So I'm working with Heuris developers, but also a team of student developers for their sort of professional experience every semester here, which is very exciting. Sometimes it works really well, other times less well. But they're working together, things that Heuris hadn't been able to resource. Our students are working on, and then Heuris are making sure it works. The current team's doing an upgrade on something that already existed in Heuris, but wasn't really, after their latest upgrade, wasn't really working. And we need that to be able to produce our bestsellers tables. That's basically what I can't do at this moment, manually at the touch of a button. So bring it into this open source software, which has got hundreds of projects in it, which increasingly looks like an infrastructure need, is one thing. Secondly, even so, Heuris is still needs to get that final stage push to be adopted as infrastructure. Certainly the other digital developers I'm working with, who work with a whole heap of universities and are owned by the universities, intend to make sure it keeps going, even if the current development team were no longer able to do so. So we've got that sort of data preservation. So I think FBT has been published now for 8 years. The project's 15 years old, and I think it'll be going for at least, one hopes, another 15 or 20 years at minimum. But also, all our data is exportable. We give it away. That's really important. But as you say, it's complex data, but not anyone can clone, but within Heuris, you can clone a database. So as long as the platform survives and is kept somewhere, it can remain on that. More importantly, Alicia Montoya's project have been working very closely with CERL, the Consortium of European Research Libraries, and that looks to have options for keeping the data alive for a much, much longer term now. So great. Yeah, it would be a great shame for this work just to disappear. I mean, in the first 5 years of FBT, we had over 20,000 users, I think, and 70,000 visits or something, you know, and that's probably gone up now. And that's pretty specialized users because it's bilingual and so forth. And I think reasonably intuitive in the old form. Heuris will be a little bit more difficult. We'll need to give people a bit more instruction, but then it provides instruction. And actually, every time you create a new entity or a new type of data or whatever in Heuris, you have to go through a process of recording what that is before you can use that type of data. So there's explanatory tools in there for users that are done along the way. So there's less need to write the full manual.
Yeah, so it encourages best practices, which is nice.
Yeah, and also basically a user, but the faceted searches and the filter building here can be saved. And the new thing we're doing is a cross-tab, so 3 dimensions where you interrogate 3 different variables to get your results, which can then display as a list. So we can arrange to look at the number of copies or the number of instances of something and then produce the bestseller list. So that's what the functionality I'm waiting for. to come in. And Jurist has built within it website building things, tools, and you can embed widgets and some of these filters and facets that you've made into it. So users will be able to go and have a pre-selected menu of things, and sophisticated users would be able to go and do other things with this data, and all of it's exportable. And anyone who's interested in it, you can also, you can upload all your data, complex, but if you've got good clean data from another database and wanted to start using this tool, as I had, all good, really good spreadsheets, then uploading them is not a particularly difficult task. So you can output the data, you can input the data very easily. We were trying to develop some of this sort of technology in our own team, and then I saw Ian Johnson, who runs Jurist, and developed it, and has developed it over 15 years. I presented a conference in Newcastle in Australia, and within a day he'd actually put all the FUBTI database material, which we downloaded, into his own Jurist version to show what could be done. And it was compelling enough that I just thought, I've just got to move to this system, because I need to preserve my data. I need to be able to work and not be dependent on the vagaries of having digital support and so forth. And we've all known that. So it's not ideal for everything, but it was developed for humanities projects.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, which so many digital tools were not developed for humanities projects, but have been used, and they obviously have problems as a result of that. So that's really great. I have so many more questions, but there's also questions from the audience, so I want to make sure we get to at least some of those.
Yeah, I can see there's three in the conversation as well.
So the first question is, what kind of books would be considered indecent?
Yeah, it's a strange category that appears in the actual data. I am guessing without checking, but we could actually run a check on what they are. If I can pull this up, if I do edition level events and then look at judgment, we could actually pull them all up and find out exactly what books they were. Confiscation, judgment, reason for confiscation is what we want. And we get, if I can go down it, indecent, we'll know in one moment. Indecent book number 1 is Petit sujet grave et quelques-uns coloriés. Partly, so it's this one is prints from La Fontaine, so you need to know your fables better than I do to know, but I can only imagine, therefore, that it's slightly lewd. Prints, this one certainly, Cupid and Venus.
Did want to be as big as a cow, so.
Yeah, and they're nearly all going to this guy Bastie on the same day, although actually not all on the same day. So he's a repeat offender with his prints. And we've got the Danai. Yeah, I think we're getting a pretty good idea. They've come in from England, from Robert Sayer, which is quite interesting. Jupiter and Antiope. Yeah, so English, classical mythology, rude prints. So I'll be very happy to export that and send that through, Eugene, if that's of any interest. And again, we've got more from the Comte de La Fontaine. So I didn't know the answer to that question, and I do now. I'm very grateful.
That's great. I think we have time for one more. Jeremy McLaughlin would like to know more about the historical bibliometrics aspect of your data. Are you using bibliometrics methods, or using that term to describe your data? And do you generally see historical book circulation data or other book-related statistics as bibliometrics or quantitative book history or something else? So I think this is a question about the term.
Right, yeah, it's about terminology to some extent. So historical bibliometrics is an established term. It's not original to me. And most of my works, wherever I talk about it, I refer to Harabel's article on historical bibliometrics and defining it. It is the method, though, what we tend to use, you know, counting the number of copies specifically. There might be other quantitative things you can do in book history, but that's how we're really using it and what we're measuring it, and how I tend to define it rather than quantitative book history. Whether there is an actual distinction isn't actually something I've really thought about.
I mean, I guess imagine...
I usually add digital historical bibliometrics in there as well. And we published in a recent Routledge companion to digital humanities. Me and one of my project members, Terry Nermiko Fuller, certainly published. Our chapter was on historical bibliometric research. So it's the term we tend to use. I think it just feels a bit more specialized and rarefied than quantitative book history, which I guess might include journal circulations and things like that, and numbers that have been derived, maybe haven't been derived from primary source data in a systematic way. You know, if you're working on the history of newspapers in the 18th century, you just take any circulation figure you can find and hope it's true that the person knew what they were talking about. You know, my bit on that for my doctorate on émigré journals, you know, I was so happy if I found a number.
I mostly rely on
10 numbers altogether.
I do the 19th century journals, but I mostly rely on printers' declarations, which really only tells you how many copies they told the government they were going to print, which is not very helpful, but it's better than nothing. And I imagine
we didn't even have them mostly on my
post 1810, very nice.
I did once find in a very unexpected place in the foreign minister's papers. In my doctorate, I thought my doctorate was crashing down around me. I looked at these newspapers that were produced for British propaganda. I'd always wondered whether the émigrés were scamming the British government, and is that a too English term, and not actually producing these copies they said they were distributing abroad. And then following a denunciation, which I knew about, this letter had been written that said precisely this, made the allegation against one of the émigrés. And the foreign minister had written to the Stamp Office, and it turned out that, yes, they were actually ripping off the British government. But the fact that he then suppressed it gave me a very interesting story, because it should never have been in his private papers. That should have been in the Foreign Office papers with everything else to do with this incident. And I knew the outcome. They rerouted the stuff. So the émigrés had to produce these newspapers and deliver them. And the émigrés got quite upset about it. And there's some evidence they thought they were compensating themselves for something else, and that this was a temporary state of affairs, that they were ripping off the British government. But it only took me one night to sleep on it to resolve that problem. Whereas the question of getting representative samples from the data from the STN took me about 5 years of sweating about whether I could actually produce a book at all.
But you did, and we're here.
They're my two rudest awakenings, I think, in my time.
Thank you so much, Simon, for your fascinating talk, and Elizabeth for moderating. Thank you, all of you out there, for attending. Have a great night.
Yeah, thanks so much, Simon.
No, thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure.